In 1846 Virginia, a wooden crate was found abandoned on a dirt trail. Inside was the body of a young boy. Days later, the same crate appeared again, empty. And then it returned, again and again. This is the folklore of the child in the crate who returned, again and again. A story of a forgotten boy, a community's buried shame, and a wooden box that refused to stay at rest. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the Macabre Record and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, because every place has its own dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. The story begins on a cold morning in the fall of 1846, when a hunter named Elias Turner wandered through the wooded outskirts of a settlement that would later vanish from maps altogether. He was tracking deer, his rifle slung over his shoulder, when he noticed something that did not belong among the leaves and the rotting logs. A box. Roughly hewn, weathered, but sealed tight with iron nails. It was strange enough to find such a thing so far from any homestead, and Elias at first thought perhaps it had fallen from a wagon and been discarded, but as he drew closer, the weight in his chest began to grow. He said later, according to the fragments of testimony passed down, that the silence of the forest was unnatural, as though the birds themselves had withdrawn in fear of what was inside. Elias was no stranger to death. He had killed animals, seen men wounded in hunting accidents, and helped bury kinfolk taken by fever. Yet nothing prepared him for what waited when he pried the lid loose. Inside lay the small body of a boy, no older than 8 or 9. His hair was matted, his skin pale with the waxen look of the newly dead. But it was his face that struck Elias most, the way his features marked him as different. The boy had the telltale appearance of one born with Down syndrome, a child who, in that era, would have been viewed with fear or shame by many. The hunter staggered backward, retching into the leaves. He crossed himself, muttering prayers under his breath, but he could not bring himself to close the crate again. Instead, he left it open there on the trail, the boy staring up at the canopy of trees, as if finally allowed to see daylight. Elias hurried back to town, shaken, and told the elders what he had found. At first they thought him drunk or touched by some fever, but when men gathered and returned to the site, they found it exactly as he described. The crate, the boy, the stillness. The discovery struck the settlement like a hammer blow. Who was the child? Who had left him there? No one came forward to claim him. No parish records mentioned his birth, and no family admitted to losing a son. It was as though he had never lived at all, except for the terrible fact of his body lying in that box waiting to be found. Elias Turner would later say he never slept another full night after that discovery. When he returned home from the woods that evening, he told his wife he could still feel the boy's gaze on him, as though it clung to his back all the way to his cabin door. He drank heavily, hoping to drown the image, but each time he closed his eyes, the vision returned, the small, pale face inside the crate, frozen in silence. Some claimed Elias muttered about hearing faint knocking from the box even after he had left it behind, a detail he would not admit in public but confessed only on his deathbed decades later. Word spread quickly through the settlement, faster than fire through dry straw. By dusk, men had carried the crate and its contents into the heart of town, setting it down near the church so that all might witness. A crowd formed, drawn by the unnatural curiosity of seeing something they wished not to see. Mothers clutched their children close, while men removed their hats and looked anywhere but directly inside. What chilled them most was not simply that a child had been abandoned, but that no one could name him, no one could place him, and no one was willing to admit they had ever seen him before. The pastor, Reverend Collier, urged calm. He declared that the child must be buried swiftly, laid to rest with prayers and consecration so that his spirit would not wander. But beneath his words there was unease, for even he admitted in private that something about the box felt wrong. Elias swore the wood seemed heavier than it should be, as though it resisted being lifted. Others said the crate gave off a faint odor of smoke, though no fire had touched it. A woman in the crowd fainted when she thought she saw the boy's lips part slightly, though others insisted it was her imagination. When night fell, the townsfolk returned to their homes, yet none slept peacefully. Elias remained in the churchyard, pacing, his rifle in hand, unable to leave the box unguarded. He believed the child had been hidden away deliberately, not only out of shame, but perhaps to contain something that should never have been loosed. That thought grew like a sickness in his mind. And when the bells rang at dawn, calling the people together again, few realized that this burial would be only the beginning. The boy was not finished with them, not yet. By the following morning, nearly every soul in the settlement had gathered in the churchyard. The crate, with its grim occupant, had been placed beside a shallow grave hurriedly dug at the edge of the cemetery. The air was brittle with frost, and though the sun had risen, the day seemed dimmer than it should have been, as if the sky itself recoiled from what was to take place. Reverend Collier stood ready with his Bible, though his hands trembled as he held it open. He called for silence, but the hush that fell was not reverent. It was fearful, as though the crowd expected the boy to stir. Men shifted uncomfortably in their boots, their eyes fixed on the ground. Women wept softly, not for the child himself, they had never known him, but for the cruel thought of being cast away like refuse. Some of the younger children dared to peer inside the box, only to shrink back at the sight of the pale face, the slack mouth, and the delicate hands folded unnaturally upon his chest. His body bore no wounds, no marks of violence, and yet there was a sense of wrongness about him, something no one could name, but all could feel. The Reverend began to speak of God's mercy, of how every soul deserved peace, even one denied love in life. But before he could finish, an old farmer interrupted. He muttered loudly that the boy should not be buried among decent folk, that he was an ill omen, a curse sent to test them. His words caused a ripple of unrest. Others, emboldened, whispered that children born different were often marked by the devil, that to place him in sacred ground would bring ruin. Yet there were those, fewer but louder, who argued that to deny the boy a resting place would doom them all, for an unburied soul was certain to wander. Elias Turner, his face drawn and weary, stepped forward. He reminded them he had been the one to find the child, that he had looked into his face, and that whatever evil they feared, it was not the boy's doing. He begged that they bury him quickly, before nightfall, so that the business would be ended. But as the people murmured, shifting between pity and suspicion, the Reverend hesitated. He glanced again into the crate, and in that moment, some swore they saw the boy's eyes glisten as though a single tear had formed in death. The crowd gasped, and a shudder passed through them like a chill wind. Something about this burial was already going wrong. The grave was shallow, dug hastily by men who refused to linger near the crate longer than they had to. When the time came to lower the boy into the earth, not a hand in the crowd volunteered. The silence grew unbearable until Elias, still pale and hollow-eyed, stepped forward once again. With the help of a younger man, he lifted the crate. Both men swore it weighed far more than it should have, far more than the small body inside could explain. The box groaned as they carried it, the nails squealing in protest like something alive resisting its confinement. The people gathered in a wide circle around the grave, murmuring prayers or clutching charms in trembling hands. Reverend Collier's voice cracked as he recited the burial rites, his words thin against the oppressive quiet. Elias and his companion eased the crate into the hole, but as the wood struck the bottom, a sound escaped from within. It was faint, like a knock or a breath pressed against the boards. A woman shrieked, another collapsed. The Reverend faltered mid-prayer, staring at the box with wide eyes. Elias cursed under his breath and forced the shovel into the dirt, flinging soil down as if to smother whatever noise had come from within. The others hesitated only a moment before joining him. Shovels clanged against the earth, boots scraped, and handfuls of dirt were cast into the grave with frantic urgency. Dust rose in the air, mingling with the sour stench that seemed to leak from the box as it disappeared beneath the soil. Some claimed the odour was not of decay, but of smoke, acrid and bitter, as though the boy had been pulled from a fire long ago. Whether imagination or truth, it was enough to set nerves on edge. When at last the grave was filled, the mound of dirt smoothed over, the Reverend raised his hand and offered a final blessing. The crowd dispersed slowly, each person glancing back at the spot as though expecting the earth to stir. Elias remained, his shovel planted in the ground, sweat running down his face despite the chill. He whispered that it was finished, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, the town locked its doors early. Mothers hushed their children, fathers kept rifles near their beds, and even the bravest among them admitted later that they slept fitfully, dreaming of wooden nails and muffled cries. For though the boy had been buried, a sense lingered in the air that something unfinished still lay beneath the soil, waiting. In the Virginia of 1846, superstition carried as much weight as scripture. People in small settlements lived close to the soil, close to death, and closer still to fears they could not name. Fever could sweep through a household in a week, leaving graves where children had played. Crops might wither without reason, animals fall sick, storms tear down what men had built in a single night. In such a world, it was easier to believe that misfortune had a face, that calamity could be blamed on those who looked different or behaved in ways that unsettled. Children born with visible differences were often whispered about as omens, the marks of sin or punishment from God. Families, desperate to keep their reputations intact, sometimes hid these children away. Some were confined to back rooms, rarely seen by neighbors. Others were abandoned to almshouses, where records grew sparse and lives ended quietly, unremarked. In the cruelest cases, the children were simply left to die, their names erased before they had ever been spoken in public. Stories circulated of marked children who brought ruin to those around them. A boy with a twisted foot who was said to cause barns to collapse. A girl with clouded eyes whose presence foretold sickness in cattle. These tales were not told with pity, but with warning. Parents frightened their children with them, urging obedience. Clergymen thundered from pulpits that such children were evidence of sin within a family, a test of faith that should be borne with silence and shame. The boy in the crate fit neatly into these fears. His features, unfamiliar and misunderstood, would have been seen not as a variation of nature, but as a sign of something otherworldly. This mindset explains why no one stepped forward to claim him. If he had been born in that settlement, his family might have chosen silence over scandal. If he had been left there by outsiders, perhaps they had believed abandoning him in a box would remove the curse from their household. But even these grim explanations faltered in the face of what came next. For the burial should have been the end of it, the closing of a shameful chapter. Instead, within days, whispers began again. The crate had not stayed buried. It had been seen elsewhere, moving through the woods like a coffin carried by unseen hands. What was meant to be hidden away was only just beginning to return. For a few days after the burial, the town breathed uneasily but tried to carry on. Farmers returned to their fields, children were sent to lessons, and the church bell rang each morning as though routine might smother what had been done. Yet no one forgot the sound that had come from the box as it struck the bottom of the grave, nor the way the Reverend faltered mid-prayer. Elias Turner drank himself into silence, refusing to walk near the cemetery at night, though he was known before as a man who feared little. It was the blacksmith's apprentice who first broke the fragile calm. One fog-laden morning he came running down the lane, breathless and wild-eyed. He swore he had seen the crate again, not in the cemetery, but on the banks of the nearby creek. It had sat there in the mist, half submerged, rocking gently with the current as though some unseen hand had placed it there. He had not dared approach, but from the distance he swore he heard the faint sound of something tapping against the wood from inside. The town dismissed him at first, muttering that the boy was imagining things or still drunk from cider. But then a farmer's wife, collecting water that same evening, claimed she too had seen it, this time not by the creek but at the edge of the churchyard, positioned upright as if waiting. She dropped her bucket and fled, and when her husband returned with others, there was nothing there but damp grass and a lingering smell of smoke. Within days, more reports followed. A trapper claimed the crate blocked his path in the woods and vanished when he circled around it. Children whispered that they saw it near the schoolhouse at dusk. Each account was slightly different, but the details overlapped enough to spread fear. The crate, empty or not, was moving through the town, showing itself where it had no right to be. The Reverend tried to calm his flock, warning against hysteria. He insisted the burial had been proper, that fear was conjuring illusions in their minds, yet in private he confessed to Elias that he too had seen the box reappear on his own porch one morning, though when he blinked it was gone. Whatever had been laid to rest had not rested at all. The boy was returning, and no one could say why. By the second week after the burial, the crate was no longer a whispered rumour, but a subject that consumed every conversation in the settlement. Men spoke of it in low voices at the tavern, women huddled together with fearful glances, and children dared one another to search for it after dark. At first, the sightings were scattered, told with hesitation, as though those who spoke feared mockery. But when the same descriptions came from different lips, even the skeptics began to falter. Always it was the same. A rough-hewn wooden box, its corners splintered, the lid askew, sitting where it had no business being. Sometimes it lingered in a field, sometimes on a porch, once even inside the barn of a farmer who swore he had locked the doors tight. The arguments began soon after. Some insisted the boy had been wronged, that his spirit wandered because he had been denied a proper name, a proper family, and perhaps even a proper burial. They urged that prayers be said each night, that offerings of bread and milk be left out, as one might for a restless ghost. Others grew angry, declaring that the child had been cursed from the start, and that the crate was a sign of God's judgment upon them. A few even demanded the grave be reopened, the box burned, and the remains cast into the river to rid themselves of the haunting once and for all. Families who had once trusted one another now exchanged uneasy glances. Who had brought the boy here? Who had abandoned him in that box? The unanswered question festered like a wound. Some accused strangers, others whispered of neighbours. A widow was even accused of birthing the child in secret, though no evidence was ever found. The air in the settlement grew thick with suspicion, as though the boy's silence had infected the living with doubt. Elias Turner, the hunter who first discovered the crate, found himself at the centre of their fears. People asked why he, of all men, had been the one to find it. Some hinted darkly that perhaps he knew more than he admitted, that the boy had not been abandoned but killed, and Elias had a hand in it. He denied it fiercely, but the shadow of doubt never left him. Wherever the crate appeared, it left behind not only fear, but division. What had once been a community bound by hardship now began to unravel, all because a small wooden box refused to stay buried. It was along the riverbank that the crate returned most vividly, and this time the story spread beyond doubt. A pair of brothers, Amos and Luke Carter, had gone to check their traps one early morning when they saw it sitting half in the water, its base darkened by the current, rocking gently as though it were alive. They approached cautiously, whispering to one another, until Amos, braver or more reckless, reached out with a pole and pushed against it. The crate did not move with the current as expected. Instead, it seemed to resist, as though something heavy inside held it fast. The brothers swore they heard a hollow thud from within, like a hand knocking once, then again. Terrified, they fled, leaving their traps behind. When they returned later with their father and other men, the crate was gone. Only the water lines on the rocks showed where it had been resting. Yet that evening, the box appeared once more, this time on the opposite bank, as if it had crossed without aid. Word travelled quickly, and soon groups of townsfolk gathered by the river each dusk, staring across the misty water, waiting. They whispered that they could sometimes see it drifting against the current, never sinking, always upright. Those who lingered claimed to hear faint sobs mingling with the rush of the river. The reverend warned them not to approach it again, saying the boy's spirit was bound to the crate and that tampering with it would only invite greater ruin. But others, especially the younger men, felt drawn to it. Some wanted to break it open, to prove it empty and silence the fear. Others, half believing and half mocking, wanted to test the story to see if it would move again when pushed. Each plan was abandoned at the last moment, as though the box carried with it an invisible weight that made courage falter. For the first time, the settlement faced the possibility that they were not simply dealing with guilt or imagination. The crate seemed to act with purpose, appearing in places where it would be seen, moving against the natural world, defying the earth and water alike. And though no one dared admit it aloud, many had begun to wonder if the boy had ever truly been dead when Elias first opened the lid, or if his restless spirit still sought release from the wooden prison that refused to let him go. The testimonies began to multiply, each one adding a layer to the dread that hung over the town. A miller's wife claimed that as she walked home at dusk, she heard the sound of wood dragging across stones behind her. When she turned, she saw nothing, only the empty road. But moments later, sitting beneath the elm tree outside her house, she swore she saw the crate waiting for her, the lid quivering as though it breathed. She screamed, and neighbors rushed out, but when they arrived, there was nothing there but her abandoned basket and the faint smell of damp ash. Another tale came from an old widow who lived alone at the edge of the woods. She said the box appeared at her doorstep in the middle of the night, and for hours she listened to soft knocks echoing from within, steady and deliberate. Terrified, she prayed until dawn, refusing to open her door. When the morning light broke, the crate was gone, but deep grooves scarred the wood of her porch, as if heavy nails had been dragged across it. Children, too, brought their accounts, though their parents tried to silence them. They spoke of hearing laughter, thin, broken laughter, coming from empty corners of fields or alleys, followed by the sight of the crate tucked just out of reach, half hidden behind fences or piles of firewood. Some even said they saw a small hand press against the inside of the lid, pale fingers straining upward before fading into shadow. Parents dismissed these stories as nightmares, but the fear in their children's eyes was real enough. By then, no one could claim ignorance. The crate was moving through their lives, choosing when and where to appear. Some argued it was a punishment, a reminder of how the child had been abandoned in life and hurried into the earth without love. Others muttered it was no child at all, but something that wore the shape of one, using pity as its disguise. Whatever the truth, each testimony grew harder to dismiss. The boy had no name, no kin, and no history, but he was no longer forgotten. Through the crate, he had forced his way into the memory of every soul in the settlement, and with each passing day, the mystery deepened. For though the box was said to be empty, the sounds that came from within told another story entirely. As the weeks passed, the crate was no longer spoken of as an isolated curiosity, but as the center of every misfortune that befell the settlement. When livestock sickened, when smoke rose unexpectedly from a chimney fire, when a child took ill in the night, the whispers always circled back to the boy in the box. Families who had once dismissed the stories now crossed themselves at the mention of his name, though no one dared speak it aloud. Some called him the Forgotten One, others the child who would not rest. All agreed that his presence lingered, heavy and suffocating, like smoke that would not clear. Mothers began to keep their children indoors after sunset, fearful that laughter or cries from the darkness might lure them outside. Farmers refused to tend their fields after dark, saying they had seen the crate standing between the rows of corn, blocking their way like a sentinel. Dogs howled at nothing, horses shied and reared without cause, and the people of the settlement grew gaunt from sleepless nights. What had begun as a strange tale, told in whispers, became a haunting that touched every household. Some tried to find a pattern in the appearances. The box seemed to emerge near places of weakness. A barn door left ajar, a window cracked open, a path where the ground was worn. Others swore it appeared where guilt weighed heaviest, outside the homes of families who had once been suspected of harboring the child. The Reverend warned that such thinking would tear the community apart, but his sermons rang hollow. He had no answer for why the crate appeared on his own porch, why he himself had heard the sound of wood knocking as if begging to be opened. Neighbors began to turn on one another. A widow accused her brother-in-law of abandoning the boy years before, saying she remembered whispers of a cursed birth in his household. The man denied it fiercely, but suspicion clung to him like a stain. Others accused strangers who passed through town, wondering if they had brought the boy's spirit with them. The air of fellowship that once bound the community unraveled thread by thread, leaving only suspicion and fear. The crate had become more than an object. It was an accusation, a reminder, a curse that refused to stay buried. And though no one could prove how or why it moved, all agreed on one thing. It carried with it not only the boy's restless memory, but a reckoning none could escape. The tale that hardened into legend began with a farmer named Jacob Rains. He was a practical man, stubborn and skeptical, known for scoffing at ghost stories and dismissing talk of curses as the mutterings of idle tongues. But even Jacob could not ignore the sight of the crate standing in his barn one morning, resting between sacks of feed, though the doors had been barred all night. He cursed aloud, dragged it into the yard, and declared before his family and neighbors that he would end the foolishness once and for all. With a grim set to his jaw, he stacked kindling around the box, doused it with lamp oil, and struck a match. The flames leapt quickly, and soon the crate was engulfed. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch breathed sighs of relief, some even applauding as the wood cracked and split under the heat. But their relief was short-lived. As the fire raged, a sound rose above the crackle of burning timber, a hollow pounding, like fists beating desperately against the inside of the box. Jacob's wife screamed, swearing she heard a child's voice crying, muffled and choked, calling out from within. Others insisted later they had only imagined it, but the terror in their eyes betrayed doubt. When the flames at last consumed the box, nothing remained but ash and twisted nails blackened by fire. Jacob scattered the remnants with his shovel, declaring the matter finished. He sent his family inside, boasting that they would sleep untroubled that night. Yet the following morning, when the household awoke, the crate was waiting on their porch, whole, unmarked, as if it had never touched fire. Jacob's face turned ashen at the sight, and he did not speak of it again. Word spread like wildfire. If the box could not be burned, if it returned even after destruction, then it was no earthly thing. Families whispered of the boy's spirit clinging to his wooden prison, unwilling to release its hold. Some said Jacob had only angered it further by trying to destroy what bound it. From that day on, the Rains farm was plagued by misfortune. Cattle died without explanation, their fields yielded poor harvests, and Jacob himself grew gaunt, hollow-eyed, as though the very life was being drained from him. The town took the event as a warning. If the crate could survive fire, then it could not be ended by mortal hands. From then on, no one dared to touch it. They watched from a distance, prayed from their doorways, and waited for the day when the box might decide to appear on their own threshold. Children, who often take the terrors of their elders and twist them into dares, soon made the crate their obsession. While their parents whispered in fear and crossed themselves at night, the younger ones found a strange thrill in tempting the legend. They invented games around it, daring each other to walk the lanes after dark, to peek into barns, to linger near the riverbank where the box was said to drift. They whispered rules among themselves. If you heard knocking, you had to answer with 3 taps of your own. If you saw the crate, you had to approach it and touch the lid. To break the rules, they said, was to invite the boy's spirit into your home. At first, it was harmless mischief, stories told in hushed voices to make each other tremble. But soon, children began returning with wide, frightened eyes, swearing they had truly seen it. One boy claimed he followed the sound of laughter to the edge of the schoolyard and found the crate leaning against the fence, its lid shifting as though something inside pushed upward. Another girl said she placed her ear against the wood one night and heard a heartbeat, slow and heavy, echoing within. Her parents found her pale and trembling, unable to speak of anything else for days. The dares grew bolder, and with them, the dangers increased. One group of boys ventured to the cemetery at midnight, convinced they would find the crate at the grave where the child had been laid. They swore it stood upon the mound itself, the earth beneath it freshly disturbed, as though something had clawed its way upward. When they returned to town, one of them was missing. His companions insisted he had run ahead in fear, but search parties never found him. His disappearance was the first, but not the last, to be tied to the box. Parents tried to forbid the talk of dares, to silence their children's games with punishments, but the legend had already burrowed too deep. Fear had given way to fascination, and fascination to obsession. The crate had become not just a haunting, but a test, a rite of courage whispered among the young. And as each child tried to prove their bravery, the box seemed to answer them, appearing more boldly, more insistently, as though it too desired to be sought out. The boy in the crate was no longer waiting in silence. He was calling, and the children were the only ones who seemed willing to listen. The winter storm came without warning, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that blotted out the sun by midday. Snow fell thick and wet, bending tree limbs and silencing the forest beneath its weight. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the settlement, rattling shutters and slamming doors with a force that felt almost deliberate. Families huddled by their fires, whispering prayers as the storm raged on, when the church bell began to toll. No hand had pulled its rope. It rang and rang, muffled by the snow, but unmistakable, drawing the fearful from their homes to peer through frost-bitten windows. By morning, when the storm had at last relented, the townsfolk emerged to survey the damage. Roofs sagged beneath the drifts, fences lay broken, and smoke curled weakly from chimneys as fires struggled against the cold. But what drew their eyes and froze their breath was the sight in front of the church. There, upon the steps leading to its doors, rested the crate. Its surface was untouched by snow, as though the storm itself had refused to fall upon it. The lid quivered slightly in the wind, though some swore it was not the wind at all, but something pressing upward from inside. The Reverend was the first to approach, his boots crunched in the snow, his breath clouding before him. He stopped just short of touching it, gripping his Bible with white-knuckled hands. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than any sermon. Behind him, the townsfolk stood in uneasy rows, staring at the box that had appeared at the very heart of their sanctuary, defying even God's house. Some begged him to open the doors and drag it inside for a blessing. Others shouted that to bring it within sacred walls would invite damnation on them all. The argument swelled until voices cracked and hands pointed. The crate sat unmoved, as though listening. Finally, Elias Turner pushed forward, rifle slung across his shoulder, and spat into the snow. He cursed the box aloud, calling it the devil's trick, and demanded that it be destroyed once more. But his bravado faltered when the church bell tolled again, a single heavy note that echoed through the valley. The rope inside the church still hung slack. The bell had rung of its own accord, answering Elias's defiance with a voice as cold and merciless as the storm itself. It did not take long before the people began to notice a grim pattern. Wherever the crate appeared, misfortune followed. After it was seen on the riverbank, a child drowned not far downstream, swept away despite calm waters. When it turned up near the miller's house, the grinding wheel split apart without warning, spraying splinters that left 2 men scarred. After it sat on the church steps during the storm, the Reverend himself fell ill, his voice reduced to a whisper that never fully returned. The coincidences piled higher with each retelling until even the most skeptical could not dismiss them. The box was not simply wandering, it was leaving ruin in its wake. Families began marking their doors with chalk crosses, hoping to ward off the spirit they believed still lingered inside the crate. Others left offerings of bread, milk, or coins at crossroads, whispering that perhaps the boy sought only what he had been denied in life. But when livestock began to die, cows refusing to give milk, chickens found stiff and cold in their coops, fear overcame reason. The people no longer asked whether the child had been cursed or wronged. They demanded to know who had allowed him to return. Suspicion sharpened into blame. Neighbors pointed fingers at one another, accusing families of hiding the truth about the boy's origins. Had he been born among them? Had he been cast out by kin too ashamed to raise him? The silence of those accused only deepened the dread, for none could offer proof of innocence. Guilt hung in the air like smoke, choking the community, binding every misfortune to the crate's restless path. At night, Elias Turner confessed to hearing faint scratching outside his window, though when he opened his shutters, there was nothing but darkness. Another family claimed the crate appeared in their parlor, though the doors had been bolted. The father fell to his knees, swearing he heard a child's sobs inside. He dared not open it, and in the morning, it was gone. By then, no one doubted the link between the crate and disaster. Each new sighting carried with it the certainty that something would soon go wrong. Crops would spoil, animals would sicken, tools would break, or worse, another life would be lost. The people no longer saw the box as merely a vessel for a forgotten child. They began to speak of it as a herald, a moving curse that delivered ruin to any place it chose to rest, and with each reappearance, the town waited in silence for the next blow to fall. By the turn of spring, the settlement no longer treated the crate as a haunting curiosity, but as a living omen. The people had begun to measure their lives by its appearances, reading into each sighting a message of doom yet to come. When it was seen near the schoolhouse, parents pulled their children from lessons, fearing some accident would strike the classroom. When it appeared in the wheat fields, farmers abandoned their work, certain the crop would fail regardless of their labor. The box no longer needed to move in secret. Its presence alone dictated the rhythm of the town, bending daily life beneath its shadow. Men spoke of it in hushed voices as the wandering coffin or the hollow child. Women whispered that it was the soul of every unwanted child made flesh, punishing them for sins they had buried as surely as they had buried the boy. Some dared to say it was not the boy at all, but something darker that had chosen his face as a mask, something feeding on fear, drawing strength from their guilt. And always the crate was described the same way. Weathered boards, rusty nails, a lid that shuddered as though it longed to rise. The link between its appearances and disaster became impossible to ignore. When the box lingered near the well, the water turned foul within days, a slick film floating on its surface. When it appeared outside the tavern, a fight broke out that ended in bloodshed, leaving one man dead in the mud. Even the bravest now admitted that the box carried with it an unseen hand, guiding calamity wherever it went. A few tried to turn its presence into warning. They argued that the boy, restless and unclaimed, was protecting them in his own way, signaling danger before it struck. But the majority saw only malice. To them, the box was not a messenger, but the cause itself, a curse in nailed wood and iron. And so the people grew desperate, searching for answers in prayer, in charms, in whispered bargains with forces they barely understood. Still, no matter what they tried, the crate kept returning. It appeared on porches, in barns, along lonely roads, each time empty and silent, yet heavy with dread. And as it did, one belief took root deeper than all others. The boy had been abandoned in life, and now in death he would make sure no one was free from remembering him. The crate was not done. It was only just beginning its work. The stories of the crate did not remain confined within the boundaries of the settlement for long. Travelers who passed through carried the whispers with them, telling of a strange wooden box that appeared where it was not welcome. Some dismissed it as backwoods superstition, the sort of tale told to frighten children. But others came with stories of their own, describing sights too uncanny to be ignored. A merchant from the east swore he saw a box sitting in the middle of the road at dusk. Thinking it had fallen from a cart, he tried to lift it aside, but though it was no larger than a child's coffin, it weighed far more than he could manage. As he strained against it, he heard a hollow thump from inside, as though something struck back. He left it where it was and continued his journey, never speaking of it again until he was well beyond the valley. A band of trappers, accustomed to solitude and hardship, returned with their own tale. They said that one night, while camped along the edge of the river, they heard weeping drifting over the water. Believing it to be a lost child, they lit torches and searched the banks, only to find the crate resting in the mud. As they approached, the weeping stopped, replaced by a rattling from within, like small fingernails scratching the boards. They fled without retrieving their traps, and one swore afterward that he dreamed of the boy's face each night for a week, pale and watching him from the corners of his tent. Even a travelling preacher, hardened by years of fire and brimstone sermons, admitted to seeing the crate. He claimed it appeared on the roadside as his wagon creaked past, the lid slightly ajar. Inside, he glimpsed what looked like an arm, thin and motionless. When he climbed down to investigate, the box was empty, and the arm had vanished. He left the valley by dawn, declaring it a place forsaken by God. With each account, the legend grew. Outsiders carried it farther, telling it in neighbouring towns until the boy in the crate became known across the countryside. Some spoke of it as warning, others as curiosity, but all repeated the same refrain. Once the box appeared, misfortune followed. The settlement's curse had slipped its borders, and now the boy's restless journey seemed to spread without end. The most dreadful appearance of the crate came on a warm evening in midsummer, when the settlement had gathered in the square for the market. Stalls lined the streets, families bartered for goods, and for a brief time the air held something close to normalcy. Then, without warning, the crowd fell silent. At the centre of the square, where only moments before there had been nothing but dust and trampled grass, stood the crate. Its boards gleamed as though freshly cut, though every person there knew they were old and splintered. The market froze, men clutching tools as weapons, women clutching children, all unwilling to step closer. What unsettled them most was the way the lid shuddered, rising slightly and slamming shut again, over and over, as though something inside was desperate to claw its way free. The sound was unmistakable. Wood striking wood, sharp and insistent, echoing against the buildings until it seemed the entire square throbbed with it. Some swore they heard muffled cries beneath the pounding, a voice too faint to understand, but human enough to make their blood run cold. No one moved to touch it. Even Elias Turner, rifle in hand, stood rooted, his mouth dry, eyes fixed on the rattling box. The Reverend tried to pray aloud, but his words faltered, lost beneath the clamour of the crate's struggle. The people could do nothing but watch, trapped between dread and fascination as the box continued its violent display. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lid went still. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, pressing down on the crowd until it was unbearable. A child in the crowd, perhaps no older than 6, broke free of his mother's grip and toddled toward the box, reaching out with a small hand. A scream rose from the crowd as his mother lunged, pulling him back just as the crate gave one final shudder. The ground beneath it shook, a faint tremor that rattled windows and knocked jars from tables, and then, before the eyes of the entire town, the box simply was not there. One moment it occupied the square, the next the space was empty, dust swirling where it had stood. The crowd scattered in panic, each person fleeing home, convinced they had witnessed something not of this world. From that night on, the crate was no longer spoken of as haunting. It was something alive, something that chose when to reveal itself, and it had shown them all that nothing, not prayer, not fire, not fear, could hold it still. In the days following the spectacle in the town square, the people turned desperately to Scripture. The crate was no longer seen as an oddity or even a haunting. It had become a moral reckoning, and each person searched for meaning in its appearances. Reverend Collier, his voice still frail from illness, gathered his congregation and declared that the boy's restless spirit was a punishment sent to remind them of their sins. He thundered that they had failed a child, denying him love and dignity, and that until the sin was confessed and repented, the box would never leave them in peace. His words struck some with guilt, but others bristled, unwilling to bear responsibility for a boy they swore they had never known. Yet, as sermons grew harsher, whispers deepened. Some said the Reverend was wrong, that the child had not been human at all, but a vessel for darker forces. The way the crate resisted burial, the way it reappeared after fire, the way its lid thrashed in the square. These were not signs of a tormented soul, but of something infernal, disguised as innocence. A handful of townsfolk spoke openly of demons, of trickery, of the devil's hand laid upon their settlement. They demanded exorcisms, cleansing fire, anything to drive the evil away. The church became a place of division rather than solace. Families sat apart, glaring across the pews, each certain the other held the secret to the boy's origins. The old spoke of tales from their youth, cursed children born beneath blood moons, infants that carried ruin in their cries. These stories, once dismissed as folklore, now found new life in the shadow of the crate. The people no longer saw it as only an object. It had become a mirror of their fears, reflecting whatever guilt or superstition they carried within. One night, a prayer circle gathered in the churchyard, candles trembling in their hands as they chanted psalms into the dark. They prayed for the boy's release, for the crate to be sealed forever. Yet as the last verse faded, the wind rose, extinguishing every flame at once. The worshippers fled in terror, convinced their prayers had been answered not by God, but by something listening in the night. The next morning, the crate was found again, sitting neatly against the church wall, as if it had been there all along, patient and waiting. Whatever power guided it, divine or damned, it seemed determined to remind the people that escape would not come through prayer alone. The rumor began quietly, carried on the lips of traders passing through the valley. A woman had been seen in the nearby county, pale and gaunt, asking questions about a settlement hidden in the hills. She claimed she had once lived there and had left behind something she wished to reclaim. It did not take long for the whispers to take shape. She was the boy's mother, and she had come at last to seek what she had abandoned. The idea sent a tremor through the town. Some longed to believe it, to imagine that the mystery might end if only his kin could give him peace. Others recoiled, furious that anyone would dare step forward after leaving the child to such a fate. By the time the woman appeared at the edge of the settlement, dusk was falling. She was small, her clothes threadbare, her eyes ringed with shadows of exhaustion. She asked no one for shelter, only for directions to the churchyard. When questioned, she would not give her name, but she spoke of a child she had borne in secret, a son who had been denied baptism and hidden from the world. Her voice broke as she said she had no choice, that her family had threatened to cast her out, that she had left the boy in the crate with the promise she would return for him when she was strong enough. The people did not know whether to pity her or curse her. Some wept at her confession, seeing in her words the first shred of humanity tied to the child. Others spat at her feet, calling her a liar, a witch, an opportunist seeking to explain away the unexplainable. The reverend, torn between mercy and fury, demanded she lead them to the grave and pray over it, but the woman shook her head violently. She insisted the boy was not in the earth, that she had felt his presence still moving, still waiting. That night, she vanished as suddenly as she had come. Some claimed she left with traders, others that she slipped into the woods never to be seen again. Yet the following morning, the crate was found once more, this time sitting at the threshold of the church itself, as if marking the truth of her words. To many, it was proof that she had been his mother. To others, it was a cruel trick, another layer of deception in a tale that refused to be untangled. The mystery had deepened, not lessened, and the boy's shadow loomed larger than ever. It was the disappearance of the Whitlock family that turned fear into panic. They lived on the far edge of the settlement, a modest household of 5 who kept mostly to themselves. One evening, neighbors recalled hearing frantic knocking from the Whitlock homestead, followed by the terrified barking of their dogs. Yet no one dared approach until morning, when the sun rose and the house stood silent. When the neighbors gathered their courage, they found the doors wide open, the hearth cold, and food still set upon the table as though dinner had been interrupted. Chairs were overturned, a lantern lay shattered on the floor, and muddy footprints trailed through the rooms. In the center of the kitchen sat the crate. It was closed tight, its boards damp with what looked like river water, though no storm had passed that night. No sign of the Whitlocks remained, no husband, no wife, no children. The search lasted 3 days. Men combed the woods, calling out the family's names. They dragged the river and examined every hunting trail, but not a trace was found. No footprints led away from the house, no belongings were missing. It was as if the family had been swallowed whole by the night. Only the crate remained, an unyielding sentinel that mocked their efforts with its silence. Some claimed to hear whispers coming from it as they searched, voices overlapping like a chorus of pleading cries. Others swore they heard the sound of children's laughter echoing faintly from within the box. No one dared to pry the lid, fearing what might be revealed. When the Reverend demanded it be burned again, the people refused. They remembered what had happened at the Rains farm and would not risk angering the thing inside. Finally, on the fourth morning, the crate was gone. The house stood empty, untouched, the Whitlocks erased as though they had never lived. From that day forward, no one would enter the homestead, not even scavengers. The land returned to wild growth, the fields overrun, the windows dark. Children dared each other to approach, but even the bravest would not step across the threshold. They whispered that the family still lingered, their voices trapped in the boards of the crate, carried from place to place, doomed to wander with the boy they had tried to bury. The disappearance of the Whitlocks sealed the town's fate. The people no longer asked whether the crate was cursed. They knew. The question that remained was whether any of them would escape before it claimed another home. In the wake of the Whitlocks' disappearance, a strange detail began to surface, one that suggested the town itself was complicit in burying the truth long before the crate ever appeared. Concerned that the settlement might be cursed for harbouring such a tale, Reverend Collier ordered a thorough review of the parish records. Births, baptisms and burials had been carefully noted for decades, but when the ledgers were opened, gaps emerged. Whole pages had been torn out, ink blotted until the parchment was unreadable. The entries for the year of the boy's supposed birth were missing entirely, as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase him from memory. Those who handled the books swore they felt a heaviness in the air, as if the silence of the missing records pressed against their chests. Some claimed to see faint indentations where names might once have been, ghostly outlines that refused to fade completely. Others insisted the ink stains shifted in the candlelight, forming letters and words that dissolved when stared at directly. No one could say with certainty, but the absence itself spoke louder than any entry could. It was as though the boy had never been allowed to exist, his life scrubbed away before it could even be recorded. Outside the parish, town papers and property rolls bore similar signs of tampering. Neighbours recalled births whispered about in shame, but when asked for proof, none could produce a single certificate or document. One woman swore she remembered seeing the child in the arms of his mother years earlier, hidden beneath a shawl, but when pressed, she could not recall the mother's face or even her name. Her memory faltered, as if the very act of speaking about him made the details slip away. This erasure gave rise to darker suspicions. Had the community conspired to hide him, to pretend he had never lived, so that their shame would not stain the parish? Or was the absence of records itself part of the curse, the boy's revenge reaching back through ink and paper to unmake the proof of his life? Whatever the cause, the result was chilling. The people now stood in a world where the child's existence could not be traced, yet his presence loomed larger than ever. He was at once forgotten and unforgettable, erased and eternal, and through the crate he had written himself back into history in the only way he could. The storm that ended it all came in late summer, a tempest that rolled in with such violence the sky turned black by mid-afternoon. Thunder shook the valley, lightning split trees in half, and rain fell in sheets so heavy the river swelled over its banks. Families huddled in their homes, whispering prayers they had long since abandoned, knowing that storms had always marked the boy's return. And sure enough, as the wind howled and shutters banged loose, the crate appeared once more, this time in the very heart of the town square. Witnesses later swore it had not been there when the first peal of thunder sounded, but when the lightning struck the bell tower, illuminating the square in a blinding flash, the crate stood alone in the deluge. Rain battered its surface, yet the wood did not darken, as though the storm refused to touch it. The lid rattled furiously, more violently than ever before, slamming against its nails until sparks seemed to leap from the iron. Those who dared to watch from their windows claimed the sound was deafening, louder even than the thunder, as though something inside was demanding release. Then came the moment none could forget. The crate shuddered once, twice, then rose from the ground. Slowly, impossibly, it lifted into the air, rain streaming off its boards, hovering as if borne aloft by unseen hands. The people gasped, frozen with terror. Some swore they saw the outline of a child pressing against the lid, a small face straining upward, mouth open in a silent scream. Lightning struck again, and for a heartbeat the vision was burned into their eyes. Then the box gave a final, violent shake, and vanished. The storm broke as suddenly as it had come. The rain eased, the thunder rolled into the distance, and the wind quieted to a whisper. In the square, nothing remained but wet earth and broken branches. The crate was gone. Not destroyed, not buried, but gone, as though it had never existed at all. The townsfolk poured into the square in disbelief, their torches flickering against the lingering mist. They searched every alley, every barn, every hollow along the river, but the box was nowhere to be found. After years of haunting, of reappearances, of whispers and terror, the boy in the crate had left them. Whether he had been freed or had only chosen another place to wander, none could say. Only one certainty remained. They would never see him again. In the days following the storm, the town seemed suspended in an uneasy calm. The air smelled of damp soil and scorched wood, but beneath it lay something heavier, relief mixed with dread. The crate was gone, and for the first time in years, no one saw it waiting on a doorstep or drifting by the river. The people should have rejoiced, yet few did. Instead, they moved carefully, speaking little, as though even mentioning the box might summon it back. Doors remained locked, shutters barred, and candles burned long into the night, but it was not the boy's presence that frightened them now. It was his absence. Elias Turner, who had discovered the child first, grew hollow-eyed in those final days. He told his wife that silence could be as dangerous as sound, that sometimes what vanishes still watches. Others echoed his unease. Some feared the box had not left at all but lay hidden in the woods, biding its time. A few swore that they still heard faint knocking in their walls or the sound of small feet pacing in empty attics, though no box was ever found again. Slowly, the people reached an unspoken agreement. They would not speak of the boy. The Reverend ceased his sermons on the subject, striking the story from his notes as though it had never passed his lips. Parents forbade their children from uttering a word about crates or laughter in the dark. When travellers passed through and asked about the whispers they had heard in other towns, the people shook their heads and changed the subject. The settlement buried the tale as deeply as they had tried to bury the child himself, hoping that silence might accomplish what prayers and fire could not. The Whitlock homestead was abandoned, left to rot in weeds and ivy. The churchyard where the boy had first been laid was rarely visited, its far corner avoided even during burials. Life resumed in a fashion, but the mark remained. Families carried the memory in their eyes, in the way they started at shadows or hushed their voices when children asked questions. Generations later, when the town itself had dwindled and finally disappeared from maps, the story survived only in fragments, scraps of testimony, half-remembered whispers, and warnings passed from old tongues to young ears. They spoke less of the child and more of the silence that followed, a silence that seemed heavier than the story itself. For what is forgotten does not always die. Sometimes it waits, patient, until the world dares to remember again. As the years stretched into decades, the tale of the boy in the crate passed from memory into folklore. Outsiders who heard the story in fragments often dismissed it as a parable, a morality tale born from guilt rather than fact. To them, it was easier to believe that the people of a forgotten Virginia settlement had invented the legend to explain away their own shame for abandoning a child who did not fit their narrow view of the world. In this telling, the crate became a symbol, its restless appearances a reflection of conscience. Every knock, every reappearance was nothing more than guilt hammering at the doors of those who had chosen silence. Others, especially folklorists of the early 20th century, argued differently. They saw in the tale a common pattern, one that appeared across cultures, the restless spirit of the unacknowledged child. In European villages, they found stories of changeling coffins that returned to doorsteps, demanding proper burial rites. In the Caribbean, there were whispers of wandering boxes that carried the voices of drowned children. The boy in the crate fit this pattern perfectly, they argued, his haunting less about vengeance than about being denied his place in the human story. Yet not all interpretations were so forgiving. Some storytellers insisted that the child was never truly a child at all. They saw the crate as a prison, not a coffin, a vessel designed to contain something dark. The boy's features, misunderstood in his time, were taken as proof that he was otherworldly, a mask for something born beyond the natural order. In this reading, the townsfolk were not villains, but victims, cursed to bear witness to a thing they could never understand. The disappearance of the Whitlocks, the rattling lid in the town square, the storm that swallowed the crate, all these moments were recast as evidence of a power far older and crueler than human shame. The truth, if truth ever existed in the story, remained buried. The records were gone, the settlement itself faded from maps, and all that endured was the legend. Was the boy in the crate a child wronged by silence, a restless ghost demanding justice, or something far darker that wore the shape of innocence? Folklore does not answer questions, it leaves them open, hanging like shadows at the edge of memory. And perhaps that is why the story has lasted, passed down not for clarity, but for the way it unsettles, the way it forces us to look at what we abandon and ask whether it ever truly goes away. By the early 20th century, long after the settlement had dissolved into overgrown fields and broken chimneys, the story of the boy in the crate was collected by folklorists who wandered rural Virginia in search of forgotten legends. They found it in fragments, an old man muttering about the box that walked, a faded journal entry noting a family that vanished overnight, scraps of testimony scribbled in parish margins. The tale was inconsistent, slippery, changing with each retelling, but always it circled the same core. A child abandoned, a wooden crate that returned again and again, and a community driven to silence by fear. One researcher, writing in 1928, claimed he had uncovered a bundle of letters hidden in an attic trunk. The handwriting was faint, the paper brittle, but the content spoke of a woman pleading with her sister to forgive her for what was left behind in the box. The letters ended abruptly, without signature, leaving scholars to debate their authenticity. Some dismissed them as fabrications, others clung to them as the only surviving trace of the boy's bloodline. Another folklorist described interviewing descendants of nearby towns who remembered being warned as children never to follow strange knocking in the night. One old farmer recounted how his grandfather spoke of seeing the crate in the woods during a hunting trip. He claimed it was not still, but moved, bumping along the ground as though carried by invisible arms. The folklorist noted that the man trembled even in old age when recalling the memory, his hands shaking too violently to hold his pipe. Photographs taken of the abandoned churchyard showed a mound of earth at the far edge, sunken and uneven. Some claimed it was the boy's original grave, disturbed by something beneath. Others dismissed it as the natural settling of soil over decades. Yet in one photograph, taken at dusk, a faint rectangular shadow seemed to rest atop the mound, darker than the surrounding earth. Whether a trick of the light or something more, the image was circulated among collectors of the macabre, cementing the legend for a new generation. In time, the folklorists admitted they could not pin the story down. Every document contradicted another, every testimony dissolved under scrutiny. And yet, the boy's legend persisted, alive not because of evidence, but because of the unease it inspired. Scholars could catalogue the fragments, but the silence in between, the missing records, the vanished family, the erased names, was what gave the story its enduring power. The boy in the crate remained beyond proof, but never beyond belief. Even in the modern age, when electricity hums through wires and machines map the heavens, whispers of the crate have not fully faded. In rural corners of Virginia, hikers and hunters still tell of stumbling across a wooden box deep in the woods, old yet oddly preserved, resting in clearings where no cart or hand could have carried it. Some say they hear faint knocks when they draw near, others that the box vanishes the moment they look away. These accounts never appear in newspapers, never enter official records, but pass mouth to ear in gas stations, campgrounds, and late-night gatherings around firelight. One man in the 1970s swore he saw it while driving a back road after midnight. His headlights fell upon a small crate sitting in the middle of the lane, forcing him to brake hard. When he stepped out to move it, the box was gone, though the gravel bore fresh grooves as if something heavy had just been dragged across it. In 1994, a pair of students researching Appalachian folklore claimed they found an abandoned farmhouse with the box placed neatly at the center of its kitchen floor. They described it as damp to the touch, smelling faintly of smoke. By morning, when they returned with a camera, the house stood empty. The digital age has only deepened the strangeness. Online forums circulate grainy photographs of wooden crates left on porches, in basements, even at the edges of suburban lawns. Some images are easily dismissed as hoaxes, staged for thrill seekers, but others bear an unsettling consistency. The same dimensions, the same rusted nails, the same impression of something pressing against the lid. In one recording posted anonymously, a low knocking can be heard, 3 sharp raps followed by silence, though skeptics argue it could be anything from pipes to clever editing. Folklorists note how the story adapts, surviving by attaching itself to each generation's fears. Where once it was a warning against abandoning children, it has become a parable about memory itself, about the things we try to bury but cannot. In the minds of believers, the boy in the crate is not tied to one time or place. He lingers in the cracks of human conscience, waiting for anyone who dares to forget him. And so, even now, travelers say the same words their ancestors whispered nearly 2 centuries ago. If you ever see a lone wooden box where none should be, do not touch it, do not listen, and above all, never lift the lid. In the end, the story of the boy in the crate is less about what was seen than what could never be explained. The facts, if they ever were facts, have long since dissolved into rumor, contradiction, and silence. Yet the legend endures because it touches something primal, a fear older than memory, that what we abandon will not stay buried, that the past we refuse to claim will find us again. Whether the crate carried a restless child, a curse, or only the weight of human shame, it became a vessel for everything the settlement tried to deny. And when the box vanished in the storm, it did not bring closure. It left only questions, echoing louder with each retelling. Some who hear the story interpret it as a cautionary tale about cruelty, about the dangers of turning away from those who need us most. Others insist it is proof that evil wears many faces, even the face of a child, and that some vessels are sealed for good reason. But perhaps the most unsettling interpretation is the simplest, that the crate itself is not finished, that it still wanders, choosing new roads, new doorsteps, new witnesses to carry the legend forward. In that sense, the boy has never been at rest. He waits in silence, patient as wood and iron, until the moment comes to remind us he was never forgotten. And so the story closes as it began, with a warning. If you ever find yourself alone on a road at dusk, the wind pressing at your back, and you see a wooden crate resting where none should be, resist the pull of curiosity. Do not approach. Do not place your hand upon its lid, for those who do seldom sleep soundly again, and some are never seen at all. The boy in the crate may be a relic of the past, or he may be waiting still, but his lesson is eternal. What we abandon in life may return to us in death, and what we bury in silence may rise louder than any scream. This is the folklore of the child in the crate who returned again and again. A story carried by whispers, sharpened by fear, and passed down to remind us that the things we hide never truly leave us. They only wait for the day when the lid is lifted and the silence breaks. If you were unsettled by this tale, make sure you're subscribed to the Macabre Record so you never miss the next story waiting in the shadows. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Every place has its own buried secrets, and perhaps yours is next.